But we're going to jump right into it. This is another update on the effects of the coronavirus on Canadian immigration. It should not say Facebook chat. It should just say a webinar live presented by Visto and SMB Business Immigration. We'll get into those in just a second. Really quick agenda so you guys know what we're going to be covering. A super quick introduction just on who Sonia and I are so you can trust the people or make sure that you kind of know the credentials of the people in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. I'm going to do a little bit of a spiel on the considerations for individuals and travel, right? So if you are an individual, maybe a permit holder, PR holder, applicant, something like that, and what you can and can't do in terms of travel. Sonia is going to go into some considerations for companies. So what companies need to know from the recent updates, again, as they kind of relate to travel and how to manage temporary foreign workers and all that kind of stuff. Then what we're going to do is we're going to stick around for a live Q&A as we always do. We usually do this update every 2-ish weeks, kind of depending on how frequent the updates are. The first few weeks we were getting updates, it seemed like every day. Now we're getting updates every week or two, so we usually do it every 2 weeks. If you have any questions, this is live. Feel free to throw them in the chat. What I'll say is we will probably wait till the end to answer them. But if questions pop into your head while Sonia and I are talking, feel free to throw them in the chat, and we will answer as many as we can at the very end. So hope you'll stick around. A really quick intro. My name is Josh. I'm a Canadian immigration lawyer and CEO of Visto. We are a free portal that helps international students and skilled workers from around the world navigate Canadian immigration. Sonia is the principal partner of SMB Business Law. You can check her out at smblaw.ca. She's helping clients, companies, students with a wide variety of immigration applications and consultations and all that kind of stuff. Sonia, did that intro do you justice?
It did, all that kind of good stuff. That's the only thing that I wanted to add, yeah.
Okay. And just really quick disclaimer, we have to add the kind of classic lawyer disclaimer. We're providing this for general information purposes. It does not create any lawyer-client privilege or anything like that, but we do want to provide as much helpful information as possible. So without further ado, let's get into the important updates. Oh, quickly, before we do that, for previous updates, we do track them in 2 places. Number one, we have a live Google Doc that I update every time I finish one of these. Every time we finish one of these webinars, I update the information into our live Google Doc. I'm going to send you a link to that in the chat after I stop talking. And so you can always check in and see the updates and links. Maybe you want to send links to friends or employees. You can keep an eye on that. And then on the Visto YouTube channel, again, once I stop talking, I'll link it to, I'll send the link in the chat so you can keep an eye, because within the next few days, I take this video and I trim it down and then I post it on YouTube. So you can always check it after the fact. Now, I promise I'm going to get into the good stuff. So let's talk about updates that are important for individuals. So what's very important is obviously knowing the application processing and whether it's happening and who it's happening for. So for study permits, study permit applications are still happening. What's most interesting is that, and I'm going to get to this as kind of the last point, but a lot of international students are actually allowed to start their courses online, even from abroad. And I'm going to go into more details on that in just a minute, on kind of the benefits of actually applying for a study permit in Canada right now. But for the time being, these permits are still being processed. I'm not sure about timelines. Most permits, I would expect delays for everything, to be honest. And Sonia, you'll touch on that, kind of what you're experiencing with your clients. But I would bake in some delays into almost any type of permit that you're applying for right now, just because IRCC, Immigration Canada, is they're working remote too, right? So they're low on resources, and they have told us to expect delays. Work permits are still being processed, especially because work permit holders, if they're doing essential work, are still on the travel exemption list. So what I should also mention is you can now get a study permit approval or a work permit approval, but you actually can't enter Canada with a new study permit approval. You can start studying from abroad, but you can't actually travel into Canada. If you get a new work permit and you are considered an essential traveler, you can still, or an essential worker, I should say, you can still travel into Canada tomorrow, for example, or any time you want. Express entry, aka permanent residents, they are still processing permanent residence applications, but the key here is that they're not inviting people from outside of the country to apply. So if you're interested in PR or kind of have any knowledge of express entry, they're inviting people that are eligible through the Canadian Experience class and PNP programs, kind of related to being inside Canada and having experience in Canada, to apply for PR, but they're not inviting those people coming from outside of the country through the Federal Skilled Worker Program at all right now. So if you do have more questions specific to like express entry and SCORE, feel free to throw that in the chat, and I can answer. We can answer more of those questions. But the answer is yes, they're still processing PR applications, but they're only inviting certain types of people to apply. Now, on traveling and landing in Canada, a couple things to note. As I already mentioned, only certain types of permit holders can travel and land in Canada. So if you're a citizen, if you already have your PR, you can. If you're a study permit holder or an express entry approval holder, but you got it after March 18th, you are not allowed to travel into Canada. So keep that in mind. And now the other important thing to keep in mind is there are strict processes for anybody who's traveling into and or landing in Canada. So a couple things. Number one, they're doing health checks. And if you show signs of COVID, they'll just turn you around. In fact, they might not even let you on the plane. Number two is you have to have a plan in place for a mandatory 14-day quarantine. So what this means is they will probably check with you at customs even when you land in Canada and expect a plan on what you plan to do for those 14 days, right? So where are you going to go to quarantine? How are you going to travel there? Who's going to provide you with food and other necessities so that you survive the 14 days? And is it in an isolated place where you won't be putting, elderly or other people at risk? So be very careful and plan accordingly. If you do plan on traveling back to or into Canada or are managing employees that are traveling into Canada. And the last point that I'm going to mention before I hand it over is that, there's an extra 2 there. It should be 2020. Not 20,222. If we make it that long, I'd be very impressed. But what Canada has done, and always, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, but this is something you should be telling a lot of people in the US right now. If you're considering a study permit in Canada, so coming to do maybe a graduate degree, master's degree, PhD in Canada, you can actually still apply and get approved for a study permit program that's starting in September, and you don't have to show up in Canada. In fact, you're not allowed. You can start taking the program online, and as long as you don't complete more than 50% of your program online, it doesn't hurt any of your eligibility towards the post-grad work permit, which is the work permit that most international students get after they apply. So international students are currently not being punished whatsoever by Immigration Canada for starting their studies online in their home countries, as long as they are not completing more than half of their program online. So keep that in mind. And that is it for me until the Q&A portion, of course. I'm going to pass it on to Sonia, who's going to talk about some important updates that Canadian companies should know about.
All right. Thanks, Josh. So as the first point, the main update that came into play as of, I would say, last week, there has been, as Josh mentioned, many updates since the beginning of this whole COVID situation, but things seem to be settled a bit, and so the updates are coming every now and then. The main one that I'm going to talk about came into effect on May 12th, and that was a public policy that government announced to allow foreign workers in Canada to change their employers within a very short period of time, applying for a new work permit, to changing the employer, reflecting the new employer's information on the work permit on a very short period of time. So what happened essentially was that in the past months, over 3 million Canadian jobs have been lost from business closures due to COVID, and tens of thousands of businesses have been forced to close permanently. This has caused, obviously, thousands of foreign workers included in these job losses to be faced with prospect of having to obtain new work permits to work for the new employers. Obviously, processing times due to COVID have made obtaining new work permits nearly impossible for many of the foreign workers, and I'll tell you the reasons. So some of the visa offices abroad, that's what I'm hearing and what I've experienced myself through some of the clients too. Some visa offices overseas are choosing not to process work permit applications at this point unless the worker is an essential worker, and basically, he or she is needed in Canada on an urgent basis. So that creates trouble for other foreign workers that are not necessarily following under that category. The other fact is that for people that are in Canada, they're not allowed to do the flag polling as part of the travel restrictions right now. So flag polling used to be defined as a process where you can go to the border, to U.S. border, make a U-turn, come back to Canada, and get issued a work permit at the port of entry. And that used to be the fastest way of really changing the work permit or obtaining a new work permit for people that were in Canada. That is obviously banned because of this whole COVID situation. That created a trouble for foreign workers. The other problem came from the fact that biometric centers nearly all of them are closed across the globe. So for foreign workers that needed the biometrics to be done in order for their new work permit to be issued, they're sort of stuck, and they don't find a way to get out of that. So what they left with was the processing time of 3 to 4 months for changing, the work permit to the new work permit in Canada, and that was excruciating long for somebody who's trying to, hop onto the next job and get to work as soon as possible. So this public policy, as I mentioned, it came into effect on May 12th, and it's essentially asking foreign workers to submit their applications for changing the conditions of work permit, which means essentially changing the name of the employer on their work permit. And once they do that, right away send an email. There's a web form that IRC designed for this to sort of include themselves as an exemption under this public policy, and inform IRCC that they submitted their application, they're looking to change their employer, and what IRCC does is within 10 business days or less than 10 business days, they will get back to issue authorization, not a work permit, but authorization for the person to start working for the new employer until the work permit gets issued. That was big. That was a huge news. That was a huge development for foreign workers in Canada. There are certain requirements, though. So foreign workers need to make sure that they're in Canada, first of all, with valid status. The ones that are under implied status also are considered under this policy. They have to make sure that they're authorized to work in Canada, and their application for changing or extending their status in Canada has been submitted to IRCC. They have to show the intention of work for the new employer. Obviously, they have to submit the new job offer, new offer of employment, contract, whatever that is. And they have to, as I mentioned, they have to send a request by email to the web form that IRCC has designed to inform IRCC about the public policy exemption. So with that being said, there are so many talks, among immigration practitioners, among people, policymakers, that this really should be continuing to be the norm for workers in Canada. This should really be becoming a permanent public policy going forward. Even though we're coming, we're slowly seeing the pattern of coming out of this pandemic, but regardless of having this pandemic, this really should be the way that we treat foreign workers in Canada to boost the economy, to make sure that, to give that fluidity in the labor market for foreign workers. But this public policy is certainly necessary, obviously, for enabling the foreign workers going forward. However, the only hindrance is that For the foreign workers that their work permit is sort of associated with the LMIA, LMIA takes months in some cases to be issued. So other than the global town stream applications, which used to be taking 10 days, but that also get affected with the whole COVID situation, that in my case, I see the clients waiting for weeks, I would say 2 to 3 weeks to get the LMIA through Global Talent Stream. But other than that, there are whole other streams of LMIA that people are using, and they take months and months to get processed. So essentially, farm workers are getting stuck with the situation that, even though they can change their work permit to the new employer's name within 10 business days, the employer doesn't have the LMIA to support that. So unless the Service Canada comes with a commitment to make sure that the LMIAs are also being processed on a faster basis, this policy really doesn't make sense unless the employer has already the valid and approved LMIA by Service Canada. So that sort of is drag that we're seeing right now. And we're hoping that in the next few weeks or next few days, government comes back with some sort of a solution with that. Government of Canada has been really helpful in, supporting foreign workers, supporting immigrants during this whole pandemic, and trying to understand every aspect of it. I'm sure that, there's going to be some sort of a development on this as well in the next few weeks. When it comes to the compliance regime for employers, I've been talking about this whole compliance and inspection in the past few webinars that I had, and for those of you who have been following that, you know that government came and introduced a new compliance regime on April 12th. Service Canada issued, sent email to all the employers, issued this announcement to everyone to make sure that employers and foreign workers are following, the new measurements, the new requirements under the Emergency Acts and under the Quarantine Act. So essentially what that means is employers have to make sure that whoever that's coming to Canada these days, including foreign workers, they are self-isolating themselves for 14 days. So within that period of self-isolation, the foreign workers are not allowed to work even if they want to. So employers have to make sure that they're fully quarantined. And to protect their wages, Service Canada has to make sure that, employer actually has to make sure and later prove it to Service Canada that the employees are being paid during that period. So, or get the substantial pay, that's the language, according to the wage range that they provided on the LMIA application, or at least equivalent to 30 hours of work per week. So the documents that employer could retain to prove this payment are obviously the pay slips. I would encourage all of my own clients to keep the pay slips for this period, because Service Canada seems to be doing this compliance or inspection follow-up remotely and virtually pretty much on every single employer that has a foreign worker coming to Canada these days. So that's one thing, making sure that employees are not working and making sure their wages are protected. The third thing actually is for employers who provide accommodation, and that usually comes into play for people that are coming to work in agriculture industry. Employers have to make sure that people within that venue, house, or accommodation place, I would say, whatever that's being called, people are 6 feet apart. They're respecting the social distancing measurements, and employer has to provide the cleaning supplies. There has to be enough pictures, enough evidence, enough support to make sure and show to Service Canada that employer is complying with the requirements. And if there's a new employee coming, a new foreign worker coming to that venue, employer has to make sure that the person is being self-isolated privately and apart from the rest of the people in the house for 14 days before coming to work or being with the other people in the house. There are certain penalties for non-compliance. Penalties for non-compliance include administrative monetary penalties, revocation of existing LMIs and work permits, bans on new LMIs and work permits, and publication of list of non-compliant employers. So Cyprus Canada is pretty strict on that, and they have already started and initiated their compliance reviews. So it's always best to be on top of it. And like I said, if there are any questions or anything as to how to retain documents or how to retain enough evidence to comply with this measurements, I would be happy to respond to any other questions.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Sonia. We do have a couple questions and we're going to get to them in about 30 seconds. Wanted to just quickly say thanks everyone for listening. Those are kind of the recent updates, especially from just the last 2 weeks. In the chat, I put 2 links that I referred to earlier. So the first is the Google Doc. Keep in mind, I will be updating that within the next few hours because I haven't put today's updates into it. But as we make updates week to week, you'll be able to see them in that Google Doc. And then the second is the YouTube channel if you do want to replay or if you showed up late or if you have to leave early or something like that. If you do have questions, our emails are right on the screen. I'm at josh@visto.ai and Sonia's at sonia@smblaw.ca. I'm going to get to the questions that are in the chat